All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whichever is appropriate for where you are. I'm Matthew Welsh from the University of Adelaide, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the cognitive reflection test, the CRT, and what exactly it is. So I'm sure most of you have seen the cognitive reflection test or some of its items. So you see the items like a bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? This has an immediate intuitive answer of 10 cents, which is wrong. And so you've got these three questions, and each one has an intuitive but wrong answer. So the question is, what does this test actually measure? So Frederick obviously thought it measured a trait that he called cognitive reflection. That is a tendency that some people had to reflect on the responses they had before giving them. So people with low cognitive reflection tended to give the immediate intuitive response, whereas people who scored higher on cognitive reflection were more inclined to reflect on their responses before giving them, and therefore had a greater opportunity to possibly correct those intuitive but wrong responses. And it's become a very popular measure. And part of the reason for that is that it's so very easy to administer. So it's a 3-item questionnaire rather. And even the updated versions of it tend to only be sort of 7 items or maybe 10. And it also has a fairly high face validity. So cognitive reflection feels like it might explain what it is we're doing when we have these sorts of questions, because there is that strong sense of an intuitive response and then some sort of recognition or reflection on it. And it also predicts decision-making across a wide range of tasks. And so Frederick demonstrated that in his original paper. So it shows people who score higher on cognitive reflection, or higher on the CRT, show less susceptibility to a range of cognitive biases, decision-making biases. But perhaps the most surprising result from Frederick's paper was that the CRT seemed to do a better job of predicting people's susceptibility to bias than intelligence. And that gave rise to this question of whether the CRT was distinct from intelligence. And there's certainly a stream of thought within the decision-making literature, so Stanovich and West being key proponents of it, that say, yes, these decision-making tasks are in an important way distinct from intelligence. So they distinguish between rationality as required for solving these decision-making tasks and intelligence. And so in this way, the cognitive reflection test might seem closer to a decision style rather than a cognitive ability. So decision styles are things like need for cognition and need for closure, which reflect not a person's ability to solve problems in a particular way, but their preference for how they go about solving problems. So need for cognition is the desire to think more about things. And need for closure is the desire to quickly come to a conclusion. And both of those feel like they might be relevant to something like the cognitive reflection test. On the other hand, though, if you look at the intelligence measures used in Frederick's 2005 paper, they were the Wunderlich personnel test and self-reported SAT and ACT college entrance scores. So both of those are best interpreted as measures of general intelligence. And so they're fairly blunt measures of general intelligence. And in Frederick's paper, the cognitive reflection test correlates positively with these at about 0.4. But the key thing was that it retained predictive power after accounting for the predictive power of those cognitive ability measures. However, the CRT questions are all also numerical. And a number of studies have linked it more strongly to numerical ability, so which is, of course, a more specific type of intelligence. And those numerical abilities better predict some of the more numerical biases. So, what does that mean? Well, when we think about intelligence, we often talk about it as if it's one thing. This, however, is the Cattell-Horn-Carroll model, which is the gold standard from psychometrics at the moment. So at the top, you have general intelligence, G, and under that, you have about 10 broad abilities. Don't worry too much about what all of them mean. I'll come to that later. The key thing, though, is that one of them is GQ, quantitative ability or numerical ability. So this is people's ability to do maths. And under each of these broad abilities, there are actually narrow abilities. I'm just showing a couple from GQ for references. KM is mathematical knowledge and A3 is mathematical achievement. So we've got these narrow abilities here. And now you can start to think about what it means that CRT is more closely linked to numerical ability and also predicts these numerically based biases better. If CRT actually fitted somewhere in here as a narrow ability under GQ, so cognitive reflection fitting in there rather than being a separate thing to intelligence, that would also explain it having a higher correlation with these numerical biases than things that correlate with G, like SAT scores. So there's an alternate explanation for why CRT might be a better predictor than a general measure of intelligence. So that's basically the point of the study we were doing, to try and work out the extent to which the cognitive reflection test is distinct from intelligence. So given better measures of intelligence, is CRT still distinct from it? If so, what type of trait is it? Or, maybe it's a combination of traits. So in our study, we got about 300 participants, 172 females, 120 males, 9 who identified as non-binary, about a third current university students and a third graduates and a third who hadn't been to university, ages from 18 to 79, mostly native English speakers. And to measure cognitive reflection, we used a 7-item scale. So the 3 numerical questions from Frederick and 4 questions from Thompson and Oppenheimer, who tried to develop less numerical versions of the cognitive reflection type questions. And for the individual differences measures, we picked 6 sets of 3 tasks drawing on 6 different broad abilities, GF, GC, GSM, etc. And then we had 2 further tasks that mapped onto 2 additional broad abilities, GV and GS. And we tried where possible to draw as many of these as possible from established batteries and tests. So the Woodcock-Johnson 4, the Mill-Hill, the Ravens progressive matrices, things like that. So well-established tests. And we did the same for personality. We used the NEO-PI3 to test people for the big 5 personality factors with the full 30 facets. So each of the 5 personality traits has 6 facets underneath it, some of which could be related. So there are ones that relate to impulsivity, for instance. We then have the decision styles, which are quite similar to the need for cognition that I was talking about before, but additional ones as well, measuring tendencies to, keep looking at problems rather than wanting them over with, things like that. And finally, we had 6 measures of different types of attention. And important amongst those, I think, is the inhibition one, which is the people's ability to, during an attention task, inhibit responses that have otherwise become automatic. So to shut down wrong responses. So what did we find? So the CRT had some correlations with the decision styles and attention measures. So the correlations were mostly in the expected directions, and they ranged up to about 0.27. About half of the correlations were significant, but with our sample size, that significant was anything over 0.14. And that means there's actually relatively little shared variance. So these aren't doing a great job of predicting CRT, or vice versa, obviously. It was most strongly linked to actively open-minded thinking and the response time aspects of some of the attention tasks. In terms of personality, CRT was largely unrelated to personality, except for a quite small correlation with openness. And that's not particularly surprising, given that openness, we know, correlates with intelligence. And we already knew that CRT correlated with intelligence, so it would have been surprising had that not occurred. Finally, we get to the intelligence results. So the cognitive reflection test correlates with all 8 of the Cattell-Horn-Carroll broad abilities that we included in our test, highly significantly, of course, and most strongly with fluid intelligence, GF, and quantitative intelligence, GQ. And an important thing to note here is that these correlations are higher than the correlations that we saw in Frederick's paper between the CRT and more general measures of intelligence. So it seems like CRT is more closely related to these these broad abilities rather than the general intelligence factor, which makes sense if it sort of fits into that as a narrow ability under fluid or quantitative ability. We also threw everything into a linear regression to see if how well we could predict the cognitive reflection test, and it gave us 7 predictors that were significant. You see the first 3 of them are from the Cattell-Horn-Carroll model: fluid intelligence, crystallized intelligence, and quantitative ability. And so GQ here has dropped down a bit, and that's because GQ and GF share more variance than either of them do with GC. All of the decision style measures were excluded, and that's because the variance that they shared with CRT was captured by the cognitive abilities. So it was shared correlations with the cognitive abilities mediating those relationships. And the same is true for most of the attention measures, though there are a couple here, inhibition and selective attention, that are adding a tiny bit to the variance explained, though a significant amount. So what are the implications of this? So it seems that the cognitive reflection test is primarily measuring cognitive ability. And in particular, it seems to slot in under fluid ability, GF, and then related to GC and GQ, despite the fact that we deliberately used 4 non-numeric CRT questions. And the relationship with intelligence seems to explain most of the CRT's correlations with decision styles and attention, though the results hint at other minor relationships. So for instance, the speed of inhibition of wrong responses and the ability to ignore intrusive distractors both seem to capture something related to what feels like cognitive reflection. And then we have 2 facets of the personality tests that came out, and I'm a bit dubious about whether they're actually meaningful or just leftover stuff. And they're explaining, as you can see back here, less than 1% of the variance each. So that is what we found. I can stop here for any questions.